In the ever-polarized political climate we face here in the United States, our special guest's approach to politics is considered by many to be a breath of fresh air. While the talk radio dial seems to be frequently turned all the way to the right or all the way to the left, his nationally syndicated radio show dares to be different, offering fresh and diverging opinions that best align with the majority of Americans in the independent center. On his program, syndicated by Dial Global, he cuts through the rhetoric and encourages healthy debate among his listeners. He's a declared independent with the freedom to take strong positions on the issues. But he always leaves the door open for dialogue. As a result, he is emerging as one of the most influential new talk radio hosts, reaching listeners looking for a less polarized view on our nation's politics. Now, prior to radio, he practiced law and served as a presidential appointee under George H.W. Bush in the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Just 2 years after supporting Barack Obama in the 2008 presidential election, he declared himself to be an independent. He is the author of 5 books, 2 of them New York Times bestsellers, a columnist for the Philadelphia Daily News and the Sunday Philadelphia Inquirer, and is a contributor to the dailybeast.com and MSNBC. Ladies and gentlemen, he is a nationally syndicated talk radio host. He's an attorney. He's a best-selling author. He's a columnist and a political contributor, but most of all, he's an objective voice in a sea of extreme politics. Please welcome Michael Smerconish.
So it was August the 20th of 2009, and here I am in the White House. I'm there to conduct what will be President Obama's first live radio interview during the course of his tenure. And I'm seated in the diplomatic reception room, which has quite a history to it, because I'm in precisely the spot where FDR once delivered the fireside chats. I'd had less than a week's heads up that I'd be invited and given the opportunity to come to the White House and interview the president and include callers as well. I solicited suggested questions from my radio audience, and they responded with thousands of suggestions. They were not the only ones. I remember well that we had family dinner the night before I boarded the train and went to D.C., and one of our 3 sons said, "Dad, you've got to ask him about the Book of Secrets." And I said, "The Book of Secrets?" And he said, "You know, National Treasure 2 with Nicolas Cage, the Book of Secrets. Only the president knows what really happened in Area 51, whether we landed on the moon, and who killed Kennedy." So the following day, it's scheduled to begin at 1:06. At 1:01, I hear the sound of camera shutters, lots of camera shutters, telling me that he's arrived. I look up, and the President of the United States is 5 minutes early. Now, I can say this to this crowd. I don't want to leave it in the locker room. You know, I've got a lot of substance I'm ready to get into, but if I ask him now in the course of this tete-a-tete, he's never going to want to address it 5 minutes later when we go live. So, of course, I said, "Mr. President, what's in that Book of Secrets?" And without missing a beat, he said, "Michael, I would tell you, but I would have to kill you." Now, the interview then progressed, and in the course of the interview, fortuitously, it was the day that the Lockerbie bomber was released. I asked about the Lockerbie bomber. You remember Cash for Clunkers? I asked about Cash for Clunkers. We'd not yet taken out bin Laden, and in each of my 5 interviews with the president, I'd always asked about the hunt for bin Laden. That was on the agenda. So too was health care. It was live on MSNBC, Fox, and CNN. It was 30 minutes long. I achieved my objective. I did not end up on YouTube. So the following day, I couldn't wait to see what was the newspaper treatment like. The Associated Press published a story that was picked up in hundreds of newspapers across the country. The headline, "Obama Mum on Book of Secrets." Now, I was the least surprised because this was a lesson straight out of my 4th book, the title of which was Morning Drive, Things I Wish I Knew Before I Started Talking. And what I wish I knew before I got into the talk radio business was this. that no matter how strong the substance might be of a particular program, it's the everyday item that has the longest lasting impact and the broadest appeal. My career path began in junior high school. I went to public school K through 12, a brand new junior high school that had a closed circuit television system. So morning announcements were via cable TV as opposed to just the PA system. And I caught the TV bug. As a matter of fact, I probably caught too much of it because in my 8th grade year, TV caused me to be suspended from school. The television crew was in my gym class. I was there participating in gym class with the t-shirt and the shorts and so forth, and as they were filming the commercial, I flicked a moon. But that's not the way they described it to my parents. The phone call that they got said, "We're sending him home because he has," quote, "exposed himself." My poor parents had this vision of me coming out of the boys' room with a London Fog trench coat on, and when they saw that videotape, they were absolutely ecstatic. I caught the political bug in my senior year of high school when I turned 18 and registered to vote. I registered as a Republican. I met Ronald Reagan and George Bush within days of the Pennsylvania primary. Couldn't decide for whom I would vote. I was just elated when they joined forces and became a ticket. The mistake that I made is that when I arrived on a college campus full of something and vinegar for Reagan and Bush, I mistakenly assumed that so too had everyone else. I formed a club for all those campus-wide supporters of Ronald Reagan and George Bush, and it was tough sledding. I couldn't get anybody registered, much less to volunteer. So I had a brainstorm, and the brainstorm was that to unbridle the masses, I would host a kegger for all those Reagan-Bush supporters. Problem was, I selected October 15, 1980, which was Game 2 of the Phillies and the Royals World Series. This was Lehigh University in Bethlehem, which draws from the tri-state area, and so no one, and I don't mean as a matter of speech, I mean literally no one, came to the keg party. The funny thing is that my sorrowful efforts for Reagan and Bush on campus later led to my being appointed to that sub-cabinet level position that you heard about in my introduction. Not long after the kegger, Ambassador Bush, because that's what we would call the future vice president and president, came to the Bethlehem steel plant. And if you can imagine this, in a pre-9/11 world, they needed volunteers to drive the motorcade. And they turned to my club. So I recruited everyone on my freshman hall, and we all became motorcade drivers for George Bush, and I ultimately became an advance man for the vice president. And years later, after graduating from law school when I was 29, I was appointed to that position. These extraordinary political experiences at a young age were my ticket to be invited first on television as a pundit and then later on radio. I cut my teeth at the old 96.5 FM WWDB, as we used to say, the talk station. Barney the Dinosaur was my initial lead-in on Sunday nights. They gave me the 8 until midnight slot. What I remember most about those days, the lineup. Irv Homer was one of the fixtures. Dominic Quinn, Frank Ford, and Bernie Herman. Irv Homer was an acerbic libertarian. Dominic Quinn was erudite and had such a command of the English language. Frank Ford was an unabashed liberal. And Bernie Herman billed himself as the gentleman of broadcasting. How far do you think someone would get today if their brand were the gentleman of broadcasting? I was a young lawyer who was a talk radio host on the side. I desperately wanted to be a talk radio host who was a lawyer on the side, and over the span of years after doing Sunday nights, Saturday mornings, Sunday mornings, Saturday and Sunday mornings, et cetera, my dreams came true. With age, my political views have evolved, and so too has my approach to radio. In neither my personal nor professional life do I have an ideologically driven approach. Please don't mistake that for lacking in opinions, because I have plenty of those. They just don't fit neatly into those artificial definitions. The first of my 5 books embraced the notion of profiling in a post-9/11 world. I've never wavered in my belief that waterboarding needs to be among the menu items in those rarest of circumstances when dealing with terrorists. For 20 years, I've been pro bono legal counsel to the widow of a police officer in arguably the highest profile death penalty case in the world. I think our borders are porous and need to be controlled before we decide what to do with those who are here illegally, and I'm a firearm owner. It sounds pretty conservative, doesn't it? But hold on, because I think we should be out of Iraq and Afghanistan. And years ago, I said the one place where we should have a presence is Pakistan. I think government spending is too high, that entitlements need to be cut, but that we also ought to have a tax increase to address the budget deficit. I respect same-sex couples and think that their relationship is no more my business than my marriage should be their business. I embrace a live and let live mentality, and speaking of which, I think we ought to legalize both pot and prostitution. I'm Michael Smerconish, and I approve this message. Now, I would argue that my unpredictable but firmly held views put me in the mainstream of America. The only people that I meet for whom the issues are entirely seen in left or right terms are those with whom I rub shoulders on the radio or in the world of cable TV. Because when I buy gas or groceries or next week go to 3 different back-to-school nights, I'm going to chat it up with people for whom it's a mixed bag. They're conservative on some, they're liberals on others, and there's a whole slew of issues that they haven't quite sorted out. These are the folks who determine national election outcomes, and they exist in large numbers. And I don't think that we are fully cultivating their radio listening. I get great feedback from listeners, and here's something that I've noticed, that while I offer plenty of substance in each and every program, page 1 issues are not among the most memorable of the items that I've discussed. I had the privilege of interviewing President Obama in the White House. Vice President Biden has been on my program. I hosted John McCain for 2 live events, both of which were broadcast on air. Bill Clinton has been a guest. Al Gore has been a guest. Bush 43 called me on the night he was elected live on the radio. Bush 41, my one-time boss, a several-time guest, even Jimmy Carter. But guess what? No one ever stops me and inquires about those interviews or says, hey, do you remember when? Instead, they will stop me, or they'll email or use Twitter, and they'll say, hey, I'd like you to know what color my Christmas lights are. And that's because of a rant that I did years ago that I've often repeated at Christmas time, where I argue the case that white lights are the stuff of suburban pretension and posers, and that what we need to do is return to our big, fat, colored light roots. They will ask me about shaving my head or growing my beard. Grooming seems to be a never-ending subject of fascination in the talk radio world. Who knew? Or they might stop and they might say, Michael, our house, like your house, overrun with stink bugs, and then share with me their homeopathic method of getting rid of them. Each of these has been a subject that I've discussed, mostly off the cuff. It seems that my best work occurs when I'm channeling Seinfeld. You remember season 4? Monk's Cafe, Jerry and George. I've got an idea. It's a TV show. We're going to pitch it to NBC. What was the show about? Nothing. But what does that mean? It means it's about something. It's the everyday aspect of life that often goes unnoticed or commented upon, but which makes great fodder for radio. It's a Larry David view of the world that I have. My best radio? Maybe last summer, talking about our kids' yard sale. They're having a big yard sale, and the prized item was a Coca-Cola, a vintage Coca-Cola sign. They'd promoted it in a one ad. So a guy shows up the night before, and he's got some contrived tale as to why he'll be unavailable in the morning, and our boys had a dilemma. Do we sell it to him, Dad, or do we owe some duty to the people who'll show up when we advertise the sale? My kids took the money, by the way. Radio listeners, they had opinions. There was a hunter who got arrested by an astute game warden on the first day of bear season last year. At a stoplight in the early morning, the warden looks to his right, sees a pickup truck, and in the back seat, he can discern that there are Dunkin' Donuts boxes stacked from the seat to the ceiling. He thought that was unusual, so he made note of the license plate of the pickup driver. Lo and behold, later that day, that same hunter reported that he'd bagged a giant bear. So the warden stepped in. The hunter had been using the donuts as an illegal form of bait. Me, on the radio, I said I saw no difference between the jelly donuts and the scope on the man's rifle that were both giving an unfair advantage. Believe me, people had opinions. Speaking of law enforcement, I remember discussing recently the state trooper who wrote up a woman en route to the ER for speeding, which sounds unreasonable, but when you hear she was doing 110 in a 55-mile zone, good fodder. One of my favorites, at home in Philadelphia, a lawyer, a prominent attorney, went to a reception in the Philadelphia mayor's office, coinciding with my hometown hosting the NBA All-Star Game. He's elated to meet Stevie Wonder in the mayor's office. Stevie Wonder says that he's interested in going to the game. And my friend said, well, would you like to come with a friend and I? Long story short, two attorneys from Philadelphia commandeered a limousine and took Stevie Wonder to the NBA All-Star Game. As a matter of fact, Stevie was such a gentleman that en route to the game, at their request, they each called their wives and he sang to them, "I just called to say I love you." They thought they'd had a surreal evening, and they were correct, because one was so excited, he dropped the dime to the Philadelphia Daily News. In a gossip column, they wrote about this extraordinary evening. But in the clip file service, that story got back to Stevie Wonder's people. He was in California during the game. It was an imposter. Now, when that man came into my studio and told the story, it was some of the best radio with which I've ever been associated. What's the common denominator? The common denominator is that good talk makes good radio. Without pandering to Republicans or Democrats, liberals or conservatives, if it's compelling, listeners will respond. Here's something I recently found related that I found very telling on this issue. You know, we're in the midst of this horrific economic situation. You'll recall that much of the summer was taken up with the question of whether the debt ceiling would be raised. It was, finally on August the 1st. Do you know what led the Wall Street Journal website the following day, August the 2nd, meaning the most emailed story on the day after the debt ceiling was finally raised? Wasn't the debt ceiling. It was titled "Testing the Limits of Tipsy." And it was a story about how much alcohol it takes to get different types of people intoxicated. Now, the debt ceiling was good radio. I talked about the debt ceiling. I led programs discussing the debt ceiling, but I talked about the tipsy story as well, and everybody had an opinion. My life is a never-ending search for content. You think I'm here to deliver a keynote address? I came to Chicago looking for material, and I got some. A guy picked me up in a taxi yesterday on Michigan Avenue. He was eating Chinese in the front seat. Now, that's not right. My clothes reeked when I got out. I think it was a number 4 with snow peas. I will talk about that on Monday. My formula is to use good water cooler material to supplement discussion of the issues that itself is never limited to a repetitious presentation of one political perspective. Others have a different approach, and theirs has worked for a long time with a narrow but loyal audience. At least it did with diaries. You'd have to be passionate in order to agree to track your listening for an entire week in return for $1. I'm optimistic that PPM is going to be the equalizer. When we fully adjust to the system, that those listening dispassionately will be counted with the same force as the P1 who's thrilled to take the dollar and write the name of a host for whom he or she would walk through fire. And I'm suggesting here today that now is the time for us to consider charting a new path, to embrace a new model that can benefit both our industry and the nation. This country is more polarized than I've ever seen it. And that individualism is dead in Washington and in the media, I think is not subject to a fair debate. Consider a recent analysis of congressional voting records by the National Journal. For the last 3 decades, they've been charting the voting patterns of members of Congress. They found that in 2010, we had the highest level of polarization in 3 decades of such measurement. Gone are the days when the Republicans in the Senate would consist of both Jesse Helms and Jacob Javits. Gone are the days when Hubert Humphrey and Richard Russell would both be Democrats within the Senate. Now, there are a lot of reasons for this shift. They include the role of party leadership that no longer rewards seniority. They include closed primaries. They include gerrymandering. And this group can't do anything about any of those. But we can impact one of the other causes, and I think that's the media. The climate in Washington is being shaped by an artificial presentation of attitudes that one hears on cable television and talk radio. It reminds me of professional wrestling that I used to watch on Saturday mornings seated in a beanbag chair. You always knew who the good guy was, the bad guy was. If you didn't know, sometimes they wore a mask and they carried a foreign object. I mean, look how our politicians treat one another today. They're taking their cues from a divided media, sparked by the 24/7 news cycle they are playing to our hardened constituencies. Collegiality, it used to be commonplace, but today it's kryptonite. Bad behavior, it gets rewarded with money and primary support. The more doctrinaire the viewpoint, the better the odds it's going to be heard and rewarded. They argue, and the nation suffers, and gridlock sets in. And I'm convinced that at home, watching both television, listening to radio, and the events in Washington, listeners become convinced that there are only 2 diametrically opposed philosophical approaches on the issues, with no gray area in between. And opinions from the middle go largely unrepresented, even shunned. And what's ironic is that most Americans seem to hold them. In the last Wall Street Journal NBC News survey, was conducted in August, 40% of Americans said that their general approach to the issue was moderate. In our business, moderate's a dirty word. The vicious cycle ensures that we're robbing our televisions and radios of substantive dialogue, I'd say just at a time when we most need it. Let me be clear. I'm not here in Chicago with the honor of addressing this group asking nor recommending that you sacrifice any business priorities, mainly attracting listeners to the radio. But I am suggesting that maybe now is the time that the industry give additional consideration to entertaining voices that can expand the tent. Sure, we need our P1s, but we're excluding a potentially larger share of the marketplace the way we're currently doing business. And in so doing, not only might you grow your market share, but you'll also affect the tone in Washington and hence the future of the country. And in the process, wouldn't we do our kids a tremendous favor? Speaking of which, and in conclusion, allow me to tell you something about our 4. 3 sons, one of whom has a birthday today, and a daughter who recently graduated from college. Time flies. When she was 8, she went away to camp in North Carolina. She was supposed to be there for 2 weeks. There was no word from her for the first 6 days. And then a manila envelope arrived, and it contained a bundle of letters that she'd been writing every day that she'd been there. I remember these letters well. The first one said, "Camp is fun. At 1 we have lunch. Today we had pizza with cheddar cheese, pepperoni, mushrooms, and anchovies." There must have been some talk at the lunch table about swimming, because it ends with, "I'm off to do a test swimming, and there are snakes in there." By the second letter, things were changing. "Come and get me now," all caps. "I'm having no fun. And now I realize I sometime take you for granite," Granite, and I'm sorry. I'm having no fun. I miss you too much. Renee, my counselor, took me to see Miss Kay, the nurse, and now she thinks I'm a freak. And I was literally going to die, DYE, because when I was crying, I did not get enough air. By the way, the pool has snakes, jellyfish, and frogs. Letter number 3. Every day I think of you and cry. Like today it was raining, and you always take me to the movies on rainy days. I cried so much I wouldn't eat breakfast. Get me ASAP or sooner, SWAT, S-W-A-T. Sealed with a tear, we figured out. Letter number 4, I hate it. And I'm sick of the word y'all. Sorry, we're from Philly. We're from Philly. Here's your assignment. Get me home or else. Yesterday there was a talent show, and I was an Oompa Loompa in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Get me out of here right now. I'm never going to sleep over camp again. Here's my mood. So far today, I've cried 28 times. Get me out of here, H-E-A-R. Well, you know me, I need material. So I bundled up the letters and I went to do my then afternoon drive radio program. The calls were divided along gender lines. All the men called and they would say, you know, I went to camp, or I was a counselor at camp, and there was always a kid like yours. And you better make her tough it out or she'll be scarred for life. And then women broke as follows. They would call, and the first thing they would say is, it's appalling that you're reading these letters on the air. The second thing they would say is, shame on you, go get her, or she will be scarred for life. As I was on the air, my wife was already pulling the rescue mission, and our daughter came home, and by the way, went back to summer camp the following year and had a good experience. It was great radio. And you know who told me? Republicans, liberals, Democrats, conservatives, everybody. Thank you so much for your attention here today.
Thank you, Michael. I'm glad I didn't get those camp stories from my child.